There's no state budget, the DCFS director is leaving, and it was a bad week for J.B. Pritzker. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. You might have heard that the state has no budget yet. That will probably be a lot of what we talk about, and luckily we have here with us Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield, longtime Chicago Sun-Times reporter before that. Charlie, welcome back.
Thank you.
And Matt Dietrich is here, freelance writer in Springfield, used to work for the State Journal-Register, used to work for Reboot Illinois, just did a story for the Better Government Association that the Illinois Times put on its front page with a Chris Britt cartoon called Rauner Gropes for Silver Lining as State Flounders Amid Gridlock. Perhaps not his favorite headline, but Matt, welcome back.
Thank you, Bernie.
No state budget. May 31st came and went. That's when, with a simple majority, most bills can be passed to take effect in the new state fiscal year, which begins July 1st. The Senate had passed some bills, including more than $5 billion in new revenue with new taxes. The Republicans did not support it, and there were some other parts of the package that got a little support, but generally speaking, the basic big bills that needed to get passed if the state was to have a budget for the first time in more than 2 years did not yet pass the House, and Greg Harris and Speaker Madigan basically announced we're going to have some hearings in June and try to get this done by the end of June. I will let us discuss this, but just to set the tone that people will see us talk about in a minute, here's what Bruce Rauner said about that in part in a fundraising letter. Team Rauner will never give up on this fight for reform. Democrats sent a strong message to Illinois families this evening. This was Wednesday when this all happened at the State House. They are willing to push our state further into debt and destruction just to continue the corrupt, self-serving agendas of Speaker Madigan and the Chicago machine. Speaker Madigan issued earlier that afternoon, in part, a statement that said the governor's reckless strategy of holding the budget hostage to create leverage for his corporate agenda that pads the profits of large corporations and insurance companies has for the third year left Illinois without a budget. He has put our schools at risk of being unable to open, denied care to victims of domestic violence, etc. And Daniel Biss, one of the Democratic candidates for governor, said, I'm calling on Governor Rauner and Speaker Madigan to do something they refuse to do, sit down with each other face to face and hammer out a compromise. They need to do their job and end the pain they've caused. If they can't, it's more evidence that it's time to replace both. He's a Democrat from Evanston. Charlie, how bad is it and what will fix it?
Oh, man. In your intro, you said we don't have a budget yet, and I'm thinking we don't have a budget still. We didn't have one for FY16. We didn't have one for FY17, which ends in a month. And from the looks of it, we may not have one for FY18. And it's just horrible. And you listen to the rhetoric, and not to be crude, but it would make a hyena retch. It's more about scoring points. I mean, if you were serious about getting something done, you wouldn't be bad-mouthing the person across the table from you. You wouldn't, as Rauner has done, send out robocalls attacking Democrats for supporting Madigan.
That was the Republican Party largely funded by Rauner.
Yeah, I mean, the Republican Party, a wholly owned subsidiary of Bruce Rauner and his mega billionaire allies. You would not be trashing the opponents with cable TV ads and online ads at the same time you're trying to work something out. That
and
just
some on broadcast
sense.
TV as well.
Yeah, but I mean, why would you be attacking the people with whom you have to make a deal? You may not like them, you may hate their guts, but to me it just sounds, or it seems prudent, and it seems sensible. I may hate your guts, but if I have to work with you, I'll figure out a way to get it done. Now, obviously, I don't, because we've known each other forever. But but that's the kind of thing. It's
my honor to know you, Charlie. Yeah.
and there's sort of a paradox here, because on the one hand, we say, oh, it's past May 31st. It requires extraordinary votes. But on the other hand, had the Democrats done something unilaterally before May 31st, which they could have, and the governor vetoes it, they don't have the votes to override the veto.
Right. On the other hand, do you think, I mean, is it part of the Democratic caucus met for a couple hours before Speaker Madigan came out and they basically announced they're putting this off. Because it's after May 31st and there are only 67 Democrats in the House and they need 71 votes to pass anything now, that means Republican votes have to be on a deal. Do you think that's part of their, I mean, it seems obvious that's part of their calculus, that it cannot be a one-party tax increase, for example?
And what I'm suggesting is that from the Democratic perspective, the timing doesn't matter as long as we get it done before the start of the new fiscal year on July 1st, because we need 71 votes in the House, 36 in the Senate if we go it alone, because it will be vetoed and overridden. And if the governor is on board, then we'll have more than enough votes because the Republicans will join in on those roll calls. They'll do the governor's bidding.
Yeah, Matt, any evidence that some accommodation will be reached, or is it just too bitter right now? And what happens then?
Well, I think for me, what happened on March 2nd when all the Republicans at Bruce Rauner's behest were pulled off of the so-called grand bargain.
Well, Bruce Rauner basically says he didn't, the Democrats say Bruce Rauner pulled them off.
Well.
And they kind of deny it, but
okay.
He talked to some people, we think.
When that happened,
yes.
When the Republicans pulled their votes off of the grand bargain, I mean, to me, that telegraphed what was going to happen. And I think what you're going to hear for the next month is probably talking about getting some kind of a stopgap again, just to keep government functioning. Last year at this time, the big issue was let's get it through the election and then we'll deal with it, because nobody wanted to take tough votes before the election. There's no election.
Yeah, that was last year's election, which was the midterm,
now,
which was, right.
The twist you have this year is, and I think that, you know, there's the start of the fiscal year is one deadline, but there's also schools need to know that their money is coming by, I think they need to get that money by mid-July, something like that, so that they can open on time for the
right. And many superintendents came to visit the Springfield. I think they visited our editorial board like the last day of the session also.
Well, and what we have now though is you have the House and Senate have passed a new funding formula for schools. And this was something that came about partly because Bruce Rauner formed a commission to find a more fair way to distribute state education money. Well, now, on Democratic votes only, they've passed a new formula which they say fulfills all of the commission's requirements and suggestions. The trick now is, are Democrats going to go for a stopgap measure that distributes money the old way? Because Bruce Rauner says now he's going to veto that plan.
Right, he told, I know the Sun-Times in an interview already the day after the session ended,
or
they let the deadline for when the session was supposed to end.
Right, and so this
session goes on all summer now.
And this is something that Governor Rauner has said, you know, he said it in 15 and last year, you know, he's very proud of the fact that we've put more general aid money into pre-K-12 education, and even though there's a budget standoff, there's always been a full year budget for pre-K-12 education. Are we going to see and that was, it seemed like the last 2 years both sides knew if there's one thing we can't mess with, we can't let schools not start, because then we'll both pay a big
because
price.
of this formula. I mean, one of the people who's been working on the formula since before the commission was formed by this governor, because people have been working on this for 20 years at least. Andy Menard, state senator from Bunker Hill, Central Illinois, represents part of Springfield, said in a conference call again on Thursday that he hopes the governor, despite his statement that he's going to veto this, will reconsider and look at that it does what he wants. Now the governor, as he is wont to do, called it a bailout for the city of Chicago because he claims that the Chicago public schools will get about $300 million more. Senator Menard says, well, really, you take away, it's more parity in what they get for their pensions because they have to pay their own pensions and the rest of the state gets pension money, and you're not counting that. He says there are different ways to count this. It is fair to all schools, and it should be done, and no school district will lose anything under this formula. Again, they have to get the appropriation to fund it, which is yet another problem. But Charlie, I don't know, it seems like the mantra that we're not going to bail out Chicago is something that Bruce Rauner uses often now.
All the time. And I think for a governor to do that is pretty disheartening, governors are elected to represent all the state. They're not a representative to pander to regional interests. And they have to be looking out for the whole state. And because at some point, some acknowledgement has to be made of the disproportionate share of pension funding borne by Chicago residents, that's got to be adjusted in the formula. I looked up on the State Board of Education's website. The most recent data is from not this school year, but the one before. Chicago ranked 371st out of 850 school districts in its share of funds from the state. It got 29.7% of its funding from the state. There were 370 other school districts that got a larger percentage, all the way up to Mount Vernon High School, which got 71.5% of its money from the state. On the other side, New Trier High School got 2.2%.
Because their property values are so high and the property
and that's
taxes
because
are so
our whole system
high.
is based on property taxes, which is not a good way to do it in my judgment. And so what the call has been is to try and develop for each individual school district, instead of the state as a whole, what resources are needed to provide the programs that experience has shown us will help you educate your kids to the best of their ability, to the fullest potential. And it varies from school district to school district depending on things like how many special ed kids do you have, how many low-income kids, how many kids have to travel great distances. And all this stuff is calculated by a formula, and you come up with a number for each individual school district. And that number is the one that the state will meet if the local resources don't, as opposed to one generic number, 6,119.
Which is the old system that
Yeah,
we've
that
had
covers
for
everybody.
like 20 years.
And so you're in the situation where you have to move forward, and because if you don't increase the pot, the size of the pie, some people will get a smaller share, dollar-wise. They have this hold harmless provision that nobody will get anything less than what they've been getting.
At least in the first year.
In the first year. And the new money will be allocated under this new evidence-based per district formula.
Yeah. But again, it sounds like the governor's going to veto it, so where are we?
Well, then we'll go back to the old formula and school districts will suffer.
Now, on the other hand, I mean, people, again, Dawn Clark-Netsch ran on this in 1994 when she lost most, what was it, 101 out of 102 counties in the state, saying we want to tax swap, lower property taxes, raise income taxes. Our governor is not even, is basically saying, I'm okay with raising some taxes if Democrats need to, but he's also for this property tax freeze, which is, as he has gone for turnaround agenda items, the things Mike Madigan was talking about, he is, in Democrats' view, holding the budget hostage for certain change. In the governor's view, we're not going to just pass more money without necessary reform. The governor has talked in recent weeks about almost nothing but property tax freeze and workers' compensation reform. But property tax freeze, when property taxes, as account for so much more school funding in Illinois than like any other state. So what does that do if we get a freeze? And where is the legislature on this?
Well, and that's what people have to understand. I think that's what taxpayers in Illinois have to understand. Your property taxes are high because your income tax is low. It was 3% for an awful long time, and you're making up for what the state doesn't get in income tax with your local property taxes.
Right. I guess our school funding from the state is what, like 26% or so of funding, and it used to be more than 30. And our Constitution.
The highest it ever got was around 48% of the resources.
And the state constitution says that the state should be the predominant funder of education, but it's never done that since they passed that.
And the Constitution also says that the state has to provide a high quality education, I think is the term, and that's the key phrase that's in a lawsuit that's pending now down in St. Clair County, where you have, I think there were 17 downstate school districts, mostly in southwestern Illinois, central southwestern Illinois, who are suing based on that they are not given, the state is not delivering the high quality education that's guaranteed in the Constitution because we don't have the property tax wealth down here to make up what we need to make up.
Understood. Well, we're going to see what it is. Just as far as in general, the state budget situation for these 2 years, under a court order from a judge in St. Clair County, state employees get paid. We've said this many times on this program. As long as that happens, a lot of people are not going to notice the day-to-day pain that the budget impasse is causing, because about 90% of state funding is going out under court orders like that. And if state employees, most of them are working, it doesn't force the resolution. And there have been some attempts to challenge that in court, but it hasn't happened yet.
Well, and the Supreme Court has been very reluctant to jump in on that, because the Attorney General tried to get that expedited.
Yes, as Bruce Rauner said, Lisa Madigan was trying to create a crisis, whereas Democrats say Bruce Rauner's trying to create a crisis because he talked about it.
And I would say we've been in a crisis for over 2 years now.
Yeah.
And Bernie, you mentioned, state government is largely functioning to most people, but I think we're getting to the point where people are going to start noticing, and I base that just on tweets that I've seen out of our state universities just in the last couple of days. We're having layoffs.
Right, 180 jobs will be cut like by the end of June or something at Northeastern Illinois University, which is in Chicago. But there have been layoffs at many universities across
Western,
Western, Northern,
Southern,
everywhere.
So,
And the problem is it could come to a real crisis, in that there's also a case pending where a federal judge could say, Comptroller, you have to move all these healthcare providers to the front of the line and pay them the billions of dollars that are owed before you pay other people. And the problem for the comptroller is the money isn't there.
Right, because
like
the tax...
we mentioned how the schools, we've appropriated more money for the schools. Yeah, we've appropriated it, but it'd be like me telling my grandkids, here, I'll give you this check for $1 million. I don't have any money in the bank. And that's the same situation.
And our taxes are down from when Bruce Rauner was elected, because January of 2015 is when the temporary income tax fell on individuals from 5 to 3.75. How many billion did that cut each year? Is that like $2 billion in income
when it was
each year?
fully in, it was
or maybe
close,
four.
I think, to $4
billion that
and
is
so
not coming in each
year. The
year.
point could well come where Mendoza has these court orders telling her to do this, that, and the other. There's statutory language that says you have to do this, that, and the other, and there just aren't enough dollars. There's no discretion. There's all this stuff I got to do. I got to do $100 worth of stuff. I only got $90.
Right. Well, we'll see where it goes. I should I mentioned at the opening of the show that Department of Children and Family Services will be getting a new director. George Sheldon has been there a couple of years. He was brought up by Bruce Rauner from Florida. He's going back to some like a private agency in Florida. It was announced kind of matter-of-factly in a press release, I think on the last day of the session, or at least this week. But there have been some serious problems that brought out, particularly by Chicago Tribune reporting about Samaj Crosby, who was an 18-month-old, I think, in Joliet Township, who was found dead in a home, in a very dirty home where state agencies, or I think DCFS had like 10 reports over the past year or two in that home, all kinds of indications it would seem that children were not safe there. And then there have been some other deaths in Chicago too, so we are going to get a new director. And it's interesting with the budget thing, that has gotten probably less attention than many other things, but that's part of the serious part of state government.
Yeah. And to me, it's kind of a reflection on the budget too, in that DCFS could use more caseworkers. The people who were involved in, according to a Tribune story, wrote up the reports of their visits, the bulk of them all on one day after she was found dead.
Yeah.
And there was apparently a contest where you could get a $100 gift card if you closed your cases
within
the
14
quickest.
days, I think. If you close
and
child abuse cases quickly, and of course, and even George Sheldon's, well, that was wrong, and that was the head of their little office or whatever. But that's clearly the kind of thing where it doesn't sound right to have a financial incentive to close a child abuse case in a timely fashion.
No, and you really don't want them to have a financial incentive.
Right.
You want them to close it when it's clear that the child is going to be safe, or at least as clear as you can make it. And in cases where you have to remove the child from the home, in most instances, the child at some point will come in contact with a private agency that cares for those kinds of kids. And those agencies aren't being funded because of the lack of a budget, and they're closing, and some of the stories are just heartbreaking.
Yeah, well, there's actually, our paper ran a column from our sister paper in Peoria about a family that has a troubled child that was adopted that's at the Baby Fold in Normal. And when I worked in Bloomington, the Baby Fold is a very well-respected, very long-term organization. They take care of difficult kids. Apparently they used to have more than 20 that they would have in a residential setting. Now it's down to 14 because of recent budget cuts, and now they're threatening to close. And this family may give this child back to the state because they, can't take the child back because of emotional problems that are dangerous to the family, and they need somebody with
$200 a day
care.
or whatever it is to provide
that was
the
Phil
care.
Luciano was the columnist. So you have those kinds of. That's just one of the continuing litany of problems that various candidates for governor are now talking about, as if saying it's Bruce Rauner's fault, and of course Democrats say that, and then Bruce Rauner says it's the legislature, so there we go. Speaking of Democrat or candidates for governor, J.B. Pritzker got some publicity he probably didn't want this week. Again, it was a Chicago Tribune story. We know that former Democratic Governor Rod Blagojevich, not today the most popular person in the state, though he was elected twice, and a lot of controversy was going on by the time he was elected the second time, but he's in prison for a lot of it resulted from about a month of federal wiretaps into his conversations when he was trying to apparently, get deals or get something golden, as he would put it, in exchange for appointing someone to Barack Obama's former U.S. Senate seat, that kind of thing. And J.B. Pritzker, it turns out, had conversations during that period of time on a phone with Rod Blagojevich. They talked about Rod Blagojevich was talking to JB about, would you want to be U.S. Senator? He said, I'm not interested in that. How about state treasurer? Or somehow state treasurer came up and Pritzker said that would be one I'd like. These are not pleasant conversations. And the Tribune got this tape that was under apparently seal, but it's now a political issue. And
also, Bernie, if you continue on in that tape, then Rod Blagojevich says to J.B. Pritzker, hey, it'd be nice if you could do for me what you did for Lisa Madigan.
Which was donate $50,000 at one point.
And I think Pritzker says something to the effect of, I don't think we should be talking about that now.
But I get the idea.
But there is an ethical issue here because those tapes were sealed. And if you remember, during the Blagojevich trial, he wanted everything out there. He wanted the judge to release everything because he thought it was, it had exculpatory material in it. And so the Tribune says, Pritzker, of course, said Rauner leaked this to the Tribune, the Rauner camp.
Right, but the Tribune guy says not so.
Right.
So the reporters.
So as of, we don't know where this came from, but it was supposed to be sealed. And it is a tricky thing because the FBI was taping everything. You or I, if he had called us at the newspaper and talked, we could have been on those tapes.
He did call me once to say he ran into my brother at Wrigley Field, Rod Blagojevich did, but that was before he was being taped, I think. Charlie, you've been around for a long time. How impact of this story over time? Pritzker came out with at least his third minute-long advertisement on TV across the state. He's richer than Rauner. He has lots of resources. He's trying to overcome this, and also an issue with property taxes, that he got a deal to lower property taxes on a second home he bought near his fancy home in Chicago. Is this Blagojevich story a lasting problem for him?
I don't know if it would be or not. Looking at it from his perspective, the bright side is it's breaking now in June or late May, June of the odd-numbered year, when the next election isn't until March and the general election isn't until November, more than a year away.
So there's plenty of time to deal with it.
So there's plenty of time to deal with it.
And he didn't do anything illegal because he wasn't charged with anything. But he talked in ways that people probably don't want to hear you talk. And I don't know, I'm not sure any of us would want our conversations recorded, but this was not a pretty one.
No, and it's the kind of thing. It would be a lot more damaging if it were leaked like 2 weeks before the general election, were he the Democratic nominee.
Right, we'll see what happens.
So there's time for him to do other stuff that will kind of, particularly in this day and age where everything is right up to the minute right now and yesterday's news is dead, for it to kind of fade away. Although I assume that Rauner, with all his money, will continue to try and hammer it home if it looks like Pritzker might be the Democratic candidate.
Yeah, and of course another one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination at this point is Chris Kennedy. He is the son of Robert F. Kennedy. He lives in Kenilworth. He used to run the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, which was the family business. He's building Wolf Point, which is a series of buildings right next to the Merchandise Mart in Chicago right now. He gave a big speech in Chicago away from the legislature, and it was on the issue of property taxes, without naming Pritzker, but basically saying the system is kind of corrupt because you have lawyers that can go to the assessor, can donate to their campaigns, can get property taxes lowered for big buildings, and we should change that system. I don't think he specified what those changes are, but he talked about a brighter day, and he's obviously been very critical of Governor Rauner and the crisis in Illinois with the budget. Obviously, in addition to him, there's Daniel Biss, who's a state senator from Evanston. We discussed as a Democratic candidate for governor. Mewa Pawar is an alderman in Chicago who's running. Bob Diber, who is school superintendent down in Madison County. A little too early to see where that's going right now. Probably a better week for Kennedy than Pritzker, but we just don't know where that's at.
Yeah, and the thing about the whole property tax system, the basis for the tax bill you pay, obviously, is the assessed value of your home. And if you look and see your home is assessed at a value that you think makes your house out to be twice what your neighbor's is like, and your neighbor has the exact same house you do, then you go in and ask for a reduction.
Right. And in the Pritzker situation, of course, he bought a home and then something about the toilets got disconnected, and it's a fancy home, so the cut from Joe Barrios to
and the
Cook County
accusation is
assessor
that he deliberately valuation reduced because it was no longer habitable.
We will just have to kind of keep an eye. We're just about out of time. I should mention the legislature passed a lot of other bills. You'll hear about them as the governor signs or doesn't, including a minimum wage up to $15 by 2022. My guess is the way the business community reacted, the governor's not going to be for that. And sale of the Thompson Center, there's something to allow that, but not in the way the governor wanted. So again, lots to watch. We will see. For this week, though, it's time to say thank you to Charlie Wheeler and Matt Dietrich for helping me discuss this. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.